Please welcome Dr. Jay Richards.
Thank you, Elise. Well, thanks so much for coming out. We're going to do a little sound check here. I've got 2 mics, so I'm also connected. So y'all will probably see me trip over this cord at some point. And I know you're here because you're thinking, okay, now what is he going to possibly say? I'll admit up front here that this is going to be a little bit of an unusual discussion. You're here with some hors d'oeuvres, and I'm going to give you essentially a talk about metaphysical foundations. I know some people that we talked about at IFWE, is this the right title for this talk? And I kind of pushed for it. And I know some people were thinking, okay, he's going to like say, you know, libertarians need Jesus, obviously, right? Well, I do think that, but that's not what I'm actually going to argue. That's not the argument tonight. I'm also not going to make an argument for the existence of God. It's a little more subtle than that. And it's the first time I've actually talked about this, but I've been thinking about this issue for a long time. As Elise said, I'm not an economist. I'm a philosopher, and I have theological training. And so a philosopher, if you do analytic philosophy, it allows you to be a parasite on the other disciplines. And so that's sort of what I do. But I'm really interested in the interconnections of morality in economics, and specifically Christian theology in economics. And so what I want to do is I want to challenge an assumption that I think is very common, at least in the DC area. And it's this idea that what I'm going to call the libertarian values are most at home in an atheistic or a materialistic framework. And by materialistic, I don't mean, you know, the kind of materialism, he who dies with the most toys wins, but philosophical materialism. The idea that ultimate reality is finally matter in motion, matter, space, time, and energy, and blind processes. That's the materialism. And it's, you know, if you're an atheist, you're likely a materialist. If you're a materialist, you're definitely an atheist. And so these things go together. And my argument's really simple, and I'll tell you right here at the beginning, and then I hope try to substantiate it. It's that what I'm going to refer to as 5 core libertarian values are much more at home in a theistic worldview or theistic framework than in an atheistic or a materialistic framework. And in fact, I would argue that most of these ideas don't even make sense in a materialistic framework. And so it's a kind of an unusual thing, but I'm a Christian, I believe in the natural law, and so I think it's perfectly possible that somebody could know moral truth without believing in God or knowing that there's a God. And I think that's the case here. There are a lot of people, especially in DC, maybe some of you here, that are think of yourself as atheists, but you're also committed to the libertarian ideas. And so I'm not trying to make an argument for the existence of God, but the argument is essentially that if you think these core ideas, what I'm going to call the libertarian values, are true, that you ought to be a theist. That if you're looking, you know, if you believe one thing, any sort of proposition you name, there have to be other things that would be true for that proposition to be true. And my argument is that if it's true that we really exercise what philosophers call libertarian freedom, you've got to have a view of reality that allows for the possibility of freedom. You know, it's not that complicated, but we're not often used to thinking down to the metaphysical foundations of our beliefs. But that's what I want to do here for a few minutes tonight, and then we're going to have some time for conversation. Well, what are the libertarian values? Here's what, I'm not talking about the kind of libertarian party. I live in Virginia, and I'm not clear what the Libertarian Party stands for now based on that candidate we just had. But I'm talking about sort of small L libertarian values that are common to free marketers and common to people that generally view themselves as libertarians. And so I'm not talking about policies. I'm talking about the broad values or principles. And these are the ones I want to focus on tonight. Individual rights, or the intrinsic dignity of the individual, that there's something, you know, important and significant about the individual as a pre-political reality. The state is to recognize the individual, but can't define or misdefine the individual. Freedom and individual responsibility, which go together, and I'll talk a little bit in a bit about why those two ideas are mutually implicate each other. People can't be responsible for their actions if they don't have a certain type of freedom. But freedom also opens up the possibility of responsibility. That's why we punish someone who does something that's criminal, right, if they intended to do it, as opposed to accidentally doing it. We recognize that culpability changes, and that is key to an understanding of freedom. Reason, every time you make an argument, right, say an argument for getting rid of tariffs, or an argument about the virtues of free trade, you're presupposing certain things, that we have a faculty of reason, that we're capable of perceiving ideas and the way in which arguments and ideas relate one to the other, that if one thing is true, something else has to be true. These are all logical truths and intellectual truths. These aren't material objects. And so every time you make an argument, you presuppose that these things have some kind of grip on reality. Moral truth, and I don't mean here necessarily the Ten Commandments, but moral truth just simply in the sense of moral realism. That if you consult your own beliefs as a libertarian, it's very, very likely, if you think like most libertarians that make arguments, in a morally realistic way. So in other words, you think it's wrong that people should be forced, say to worship God in a way that they don't believe in. You think it's wrong to coerce people to do things like that. It's not just that you think, well, it's not prudent to do that. We really shouldn't lock people up in the gulag and torture them until they, sort of recite a creed or something, But no, you think that it's wrong. You think that just down in your bones, as certainly as you know anything, that it's wrong. That's moral realism. And so the question is, not whether do atheists know moral truth. Of course they do. Christopher Hitchens knew as well as I did, and do now, that it's wrong to torture a small child for the fun of it. It's not like because I'm a Christian I know that Hitchens thought, no, he's an atheist, so that's fine. He knew moral truth as well as I did in many cases, and that's what I'm talking about. And then finally, limited government, because the arguments for limited government actually presuppose all those other things. And so if we say those are important values, those are all values that I defend. I've written on this, I talk about these subjects, I'm passionate about it. But the question is, in what view of reality do these things make sense? And I don't want to stack the deck against materialism, and so I'm going to primarily quote materialists to explain to us what the implications of materialism are for individual rights, freedom and individual responsibility, reason, moral truth, and limited government. All right? Well, there's a kind of here's the way I'm going to sort of frame it. So if you're thinking, okay, what's his argument like? I want you to think of two hypotheses, two ways of viewing reality. It's not the only two possible ways, obviously. These are mutually exclusive but not jointly exhaustive, right? But they're the two main options that people have in their minds when they're thinking about how to explain reality. One is theism. And what is theism? Theism isn't the belief that God has a white beard, if anyone thinks that. Theism is just the belief, it's a claim about what the nature of ultimate reality is. If you're a theist, you believe that the ultimate reality is God, that God is a transcendent, perfect, all-powerful, holy, good, rational being who has the capacity to call other things into existence out of nothing, simply by choosing to do so. And so that everything else that exists, other than God, exists because of God's choice and because he freely both created it and sustains it. That's theism. It's a claim about what constitutes ultimate reality. It doesn't claim that there's no matter or material universe. It simply says that the material universe is a derivative reality rather than a fundamental reality. Materialism, on the other hand, says there is no such person or thing like God, nothing like that. Ultimate reality is, as Carl Sagan famously said, the late astronomer, he said, the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. That's the fundamental reality. If you're a Christian, that may sound like the Gloria Patri to you, and there's a reason. I mean, Sagan knew what he was saying. He was attributing things traditionally applied to God to the created order. And so that's the idea. And everybody, if they sort of think through the foundations of their beliefs, everybody has a kind of ultimate belief, the stopping point of explanation, in which you say, this is the thing that explains everything else. And so for the materialist, it's the material universe. For the theist, it's God. All right, so those are the two. So what I want you to do is just think about, just compare these two and say, in which of these frameworks do the libertarian values fit most naturally? That's the question I want to ask. Well, there's a kind of an intuitive sense in which individual rights has a theistic foundation. This is not a claim that has been widely held in history. In fact, most cultures and most times and places in history explicitly deny that human beings have some kind of intrinsic equal value or worth, right? If you read Plato or Aristotle, for instance, some people were born to be slaves, some people were born to be slaveholders, and that was their nature, right? But even a sort of theistic rationalist and not Orthodox Christian Thomas Jefferson, when he sat down to write the Declaration of Independence, understood and made it explicit that we have rights, because what did he say? We all know this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. All right. Now, it turns out Jefferson, when he wrote this, if you know the history, he actually wrote, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. Benjamin Franklin suggested self-evident. I actually think that might have been a mistake because they're not self-evident to ordinary reason. If you think fully about what the human person is, I think you can kind of come to a conclusion, but it's not self-evident in the same way that 2 + 2 = 4 is self-evident, right? There's actual disagreement. And so the question is, what do you do with this conviction that we have intrinsic rights and value and dignity, and we ought to be treated equal before the law because of that? So a just and limited government will recognize our rights, will recognize what the human person is, and will leave that outside its jurisdiction. It's really easy to explain how this can be the case in a theistic framework, especially a Christian framework in which God creates the world. He's personal. He exercises freedom and creativity, and he creates beings who have those same capacities in a much more limited way. It all makes perfect sense. What do you do if you're a materialist? How do you explain individual rights? Many of you that know the UN Declaration on Human Rights, when the debate was raging now, it's been about 60 years, I guess, or more, about how to articulate a universal declaration of human rights, and mostly Europeans that were involved in this thought, where are we going to ground this? I mean, how do we kind of justify it? It's not like it's an empirical truth. I mean, look around. It's not necessarily obvious, right? I mean, we all know people that are smarter than others, or more attractive than others. Some are hard workers, some are lazy, some are honest, some are liars, and you know the proportions change from the different parts of the country on those two things. But you know, around so why on earth would you think that we're equal? Well, I think it's very hard to actually ground that without something like a theological claim, because it's clearly not an empirical reality. What happened with the Universal Declaration on Human Rights is that the committee finally used the formulation and understanding of Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain. So they implicitly, though most of them were not theists, recognized, okay, there's really no other way to sort of ground this. And so there's an intuitive sense in which there's a connection between individual rights and God. But even atheists recognize this. One of my favorite quotes from Ayn Rand, and some of you know I write on Rand frequently. I have a kind of a love-hate relationship with her, you know, because it's part of it. She got so many things right, but she got, I think, some things fundamentally wrong. Here's something she got exactly right, though. So what Rand said, she said, man, every man, that is every human being, is an end in himself, not a mere means to the ends of others. You know, where did she get this idea that we're ends in ourselves? Each of us has this kind of intrinsic purpose. We have a natural teleology and an end toward which we trend, and that should be allowed to happen, that we shouldn't simply be cogs in a mechanistic wheel of the state. Well, I think this is at a kind of an implicitly theistic understanding. It makes perfect sense in a theological context. What's so amazing about this idea of individual rights and human equality is that it's so compelling once it's articulated clearly that it becomes attractive, so that even someone who denies the metaphysical foundations of the idea nevertheless identifies with it. This is an example, I think, of the natural law, that people have the law written on their hearts, and so they see this in a kind of fragmented way, and I think Rand saw that. The problem is this would be very hard to maintain in a materialistic framework, and let me just sort of give you a couple of examples. B.F. Skinner, the founder of behaviorism, wrote a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. All right, ideas were all the rage in the mid part of the 20th century. And in this book, he essentially denies the very idea that there is a person, that there is something called man. Here's how he puts it. He says, autonomous man has been constructed from our ignorance, and as our understanding increases, the very stuff of which he is composed vanishes. To man qua man, we readily say good riddance. Only by dispossessing him can we turn to the real causes of human behavior. Only then can we turn from the inferred to the observed, from the miraculous to the natural, from the inaccessible to the manipulable. You see the idea? This doesn't make any sense. Look, if we are matter in motion, we are simply the sum total of nature and nurture. The laws of physics and chemistry have determined what we're going to do. And the idea that there's this autonomous self that can actually make choices, it disappears in a materialistic framework. In Skinner, I could give you lots of examples of quotes like this. It's simply articulating, you might think this sounds quite extreme, and it is, because it seems to deny something we all know, right? It denies that you don't exist. My view is any argument that entails you don't exist, you have a very good reason not to believe. But nevertheless, right, I think what Skinner was doing is he was simply drawing out the logical implications of materialism. So if materialism is true, it's very hard even to say that there are human individuals. Okay. It's also very difficult to say there's something like freedom or responsibility. There's a book by the philosopher Bertrand Russell called Why I'm Not a Christian. I read this when I was in college, and I was struggling with questions of faith, and I had read C.S. Lewis, and I thought, I really need to read widely from the best thinkers on all these subjects. And I read Why I'm Not a Christian, and honestly, I was not compelled by the book. I thought he sort of misunderstood a lot of things. He's a very smart guy. But in that book, this is what he says about freedom and responsibility. He said, when a man acts in ways that annoy us, we wish to think him wicked, and we refuse to face the fact that his annoying behavior is the result of antecedent causes which, if we follow them long enough, will take you beyond the moment of his birth, and therefore to events for which he cannot be held responsible by any stretch of the imagination. Now, do you see the point? That if we actually understand the materialistic account of reality and we buy it, we embrace it, we have to realize that the things that we look out at the world and see people do are not things that they're choosing and for which they're exercising freedom and could be responsible. They're simply living out, the sort of implications and the antecedent conditions that have brought them into existence. Russell was a determinist, and so he thought everything that we do is ultimately determined by physics. So no freedom and responsibility. This isn't an argument from some creationists. This is an argument from one of the leading materialist intellectuals of the 20th century. So no individuals, no individual rights, no freedom, no responsibility. Right? And this issue is constantly framed in this way, and I think it's actually implicitly materialistic. The question is, okay, how much of what you do, what you like, what you choose is the result of nature, and how much is the result of nurture? Or that is, how much is the result of physics and chemistry and your biology? How much is the result of your environment and your upbringing? Now notice the assumption here is that those are jointly exhaustive. That once if you could give a full account of a human person in terms of their kind of physical nature and in terms of their environment and background, you would have a complete account with no remainder left for the human person. That's the logic of materialism when it comes to the individual. What does libertarian freedom require? Libertarian freedom, some of you may know this, libertarian freedom is actually a technical word used in philosophy to refer to the kind of freedom all of us think that we have. Libertarian freedom is not simply that you're free if you do what you want to do. At some point you wonder, yeah, gosh, I really like cleaning out latrines, and I like eating hay for dinner, and you want to do these things, so everything you're doing is something you want to do, but then you find out that there's an evil scientist that's put a cortical implant in your brain, and he's able to control what you want, right? Well, everything you're doing what you want, right? But would any of us think that you're free as a result of that? No, we know that freedom requires something else. Libertarian freedom essentially requires that agents be capable of choosing between mutually exclusive alternatives. That's libertarian freedom. And so does this say that are we sort of just ghosts disembodied that are unaffected by our physical characteristics or our nurture? No, of course not. We're embodied creatures. And so we are shaped by our nurture. We're shaped by our disposition. In fact, Arthur Brooks is right. I'm hoping he's wrong. About 40% of how happy we are is based primarily on heredity, which is depressing because my whole family's depressed. So I always hate that, But of course, we are shaped by the physical reality, by the way in which we're raised. But the question is there anything else remaining after that? Do those fully determine us? Or is there, in addition to nature and nurture, also an agent? And an agent who's actually able to make choices and to see the possibility and the implications of those choices and choose one rather than the other in a way that that choice is not fully determined by nature and nurture. That's what libertarian freedom requires. That is a very strong and a very robust claim. I'm convinced most of us, we think we have that kind of freedom simply because we directly experience it. This is what's difficult about thinking about these metaphysical issues, is that in order to think about these, you've got to not consult your common sense. What you want to know is, what would the world have to be like if materialism were true? Right? And so you can't always be consulting, well, I already know that we have freedom, and so it must somehow be compatible. No, try to step outside that and say, what would need to be true, though, about reality if materialism were true? I think what would need to be true is that there simply isn't anything like this. And I've got dozens of quotes from materialists explaining this. This idea of a centered subjective self that remembers and acts is often simply by materialists considered an illusion. All right? So no freedom, and no individual rights, and reason. All right, now this is going to be the most difficult part of the talk here, so I'm going to take a little time. I'm going to give you some arguments that some of you may have heard, but unless you study philosophy, you're probably not going to have heard of these. But this has to do with the nature of our reason. Two ways to get at this argument. One is a very short couple of pages, 6 pages, I think, in C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, where he makes this argument kind of intuitively about reason. It's essentially, his argument is that, look, reason requires the ability to choose and to discern rational properties. You know, if A, then B, A, therefore B. There's a logical relation. If you see that it's true, you just see it's true. But these are immaterial things. They're sort of truths. And Lewis says, look, how is it that that kind of capacity could emerge from a non-rational source? And I think his argument has some intuitive force. But there's a way of making it much more rigorously. And what's funny is that Charles Darwin himself worried about this. Here's what Darwin said about the matter. He said, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the minds of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? All right, now this worried him. He sort of realized the implications of his idea. Now, I don't think, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on evolution and Darwinism and all this kind of stuff, but what I want you to see, set aside the question about the age of the universe and whether some organisms share a common ancestor with others. And frankly, I think that natural selection explains some things. I don't think it explains everything. But all I want you to understand is that if materialism is true and the Darwinian account is true, the Darwinian account is entirely blind and purposeless. It is a mechanistic and impersonal process that produces things that appear to be designed but are not ultimately designed. So the Darwinian theory is that essentially organisms all share a common ancestor, and all the diversity and adaptive complexity we see around us is a result of a kind of mechanistic process called natural selection. And then natural selection sifts from variations in a population. So you got water buffalo, some run faster than others, some have sharper horns. If the speedy running and sharper horns gives it a survival advantage, then that water buffalo will tend to predominate and survive and reproduce, and then that trait will move on. Now, I think actually natural selection explains that kind of survival of the fittest in a population very well. It's a second question whether it explains the origin of these things altogether. But what I want you to see is that if the Darwinian, fully materialistic Darwinian account is true, everything about us is ultimately the result of blind and purposeless processes. And whatever our capacities are, they have to be capacities that could be created by a blind Darwinian process. I'm not talking about, you know, could God guide evolution in some way so he actually does things? Yeah, but that's not the Darwinian account. And this is what worried Darwin. And this is actually a perennial problem in philosophy. I mean, Darwin's Doubt was essentially, look, I mean, you know, maybe the orangutan, you know, maybe it has beliefs, but, you know, you work your way back, right, back past our evolutionary history, and you assume not that God has been guiding things along to give rise to human beings, but that merely the result of natural selection over time gave rise to us. And he worried that, you know, can we really trust our reason? And you see how corroding this is, because remember, his argument's based on reason. He thinks he has empirical evidence for his theory, and yet his theory implies that maybe the very capacity for reason is not reliable. So it's what philosophers call self-stultifying. It sort of undercuts itself. Darwin put it kind of implicitly. Patricia Churchland, a famous analytic philosopher and a reductionist materialist, put it, I think, really well here. I don't know if this is too racy or not, but here it is. Here's what Churchland said. It's a famous quote. She said, "Boiled down to essentials, a nervous system enables the organism to succeed in the 4 F's. Feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing." All right? The principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. Improvements in sensor motor control confer an evolutionary advantage. A fancier style of representing is advantageous so long as it's geared to the organism's way of life and enhances the organism's chances of survival. Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. And this is the general understanding of reason and truth from a reductive materialist perspective. And she puts that so perfectly well. But the point is that everything about us can simply has to be explained as a result of a blind process of random variation, primarily random genetic mutations, and natural selection preserving certain traits. Now, you might think initially, and this is where people go usually when they first start thinking about this, they think, well, no, but wait, if I can exercise reason and I know truths and things like that, won't that give me a survival advantage? Of course it will. Yeah, of course, if you sort of generally have true beliefs about the world, then that would confer a survival advantage. The question is, how reliable would this process be for actually producing faculties that generally give us true beliefs about the world? In fact, the very idea of beliefs is problematic in a materialistic framework. Now, some of you may know there's a famous Christian philosopher named Alvin Plantinga. I've had some interaction with him on this. He's a wonderful person. He's been developing an argument for about 20 years called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And he's kind of perfected the argument. And I think it's finally in its final form. I think it's one of the most formidable challenges to a materialistic understanding of reality. Now, his argument is not that naturalism can't be true or Darwinian evolution can't be true, but that it's very unlikely that if both naturalism and Darwinian evolution are true, that our belief-producing capacities are reliable. Now, here's the actual form of the argument. Don't panic. All right, I know when people see this, I just wanted you to see that it's actually, he's formulated it. It isn't as scary as it looks if you're not used to analytic philosophy. It essentially means this. So the P, the R, the N, and the E, they stand in for particular ideas. So P is a probability. P means there's a conditional probability, which means a probability conditional on these factors. So the first claim is simply that the probability that we would have reliable belief-producing faculties given naturalism or materialism and Darwinian evolution is low. And so what that means is that anyone who believes both naturalism and Darwinian evolution and sees that the probability that our faculties are reliable given those two ideas is low has a defeater for R. A defeater is just simply something you learn that now defeats something that you previously believed, right? Like when you discover that a mad scientist has planted a cortical implant right in your head and making you like all these things. That's the idea of a defeater. And so if you believe these two things, both naturalism and fully Darwinian account of evolution, you now have a defeater for the belief that your rational faculties are reliable. And so it goes on like this. I'll read it very quickly and then I'll give this to you intuitively. So anyone who has a defeater for R, for the reliability of these faculties, has a defeater for any other belief that she thinks she has, including N and E itself. In other words, including naturalism or materialism and Darwinian evolution itself. Because remember, you believe those based upon trusting that your rational faculties allow you to actually look at evidence and argument and come to something like true belief. And so if one accepts N and E, thereby acquires a defeater for N and E, N and E is self-defeating and can't be rationally accepted. Okay, in other words, it's not an argument against naturalism. It's simply that if you believe both naturalism and a fully Darwinian account of the human person, you now have a defeater. It undercuts your belief in the rationality of the whole enterprise, including your belief in these ideas. Now, what's going on here? I could bore you to tears with this for several hours. And at the Discovery Institute, we do these summer seminars that are private, and so we get people together and we liquor them up and deprive them of sleep and talk about this stuff for 9 days. And we don't have that kind of time tonight, and we don't have any alcohol. So, all right. So what's happening here? Let me just give you this kind of intuitive way of thinking of it. Think about the Darwinian backstory. Okay, so Darwin was talking about the thoughts of a monkey's mind, but think about, assume for a minute, okay, not just that, life, there's a long history to life, and there are different animals alive and different organisms at different times in history and all those things, but assume that the story is fully Darwinian, okay, and fully materialistic. Then what that means is that there was a time in the history of the cosmos, actually we're starting at 5 billion years on this, so you've got 13.7 billion years as a sort of t equals 0, or at least when I think matter and radiation separated. And sometime after 5 billion years ago, the Earth forms. It's estimated usually around 4 billion years. There seemed to have been life almost immediately after the Earth formed, something like maybe 3.8, 3.9 billion years, for a long time. For billions of years, these were very simple forms of life. Prokaryotes, and then bacteria that have a nucleus in the cell, and lots of kind of simple life like that. And that's what existed for billions of years. Okay, now, so did these early prokaryotes, did they have beliefs? No. Well, what did they have? Well, they presumably, let's just assume that somehow we got life. Okay, Darwin didn't account for that, but assume some interesting thing happened that gave rise to the first reproducing cell. Okay, so now natural selection can actually can do something. But what's natural selection going to preserve? It's going to preserve survival-enhancing behavior. Right? Natural selection will be, that's available to natural selection. So if certain bacteria, for instance, move in a certain way toward a food source, that's going to be selected, that behavior, right? Whereas the ones that, for whatever reason, sort of go away from the food source, that's going to get weeded out. Now, do bacteria need to believe, oh, the food's over there, right? Nobody thinks that's what's going on, right? So in other words, for billions of years, natural selection was simply selecting for survival enhancing behavior. And then so somewhere along the line here, you get, 570 million years ago, you get the Cambrian fauna and about 40 different kinds of body plans of animals. And then sometime very, 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 very recently in a cosmic time scale, you get human beings. Somewhere there in the last few million years, beliefs would have popped up, presumably, right? Maybe it was the monkeys, maybe it was the proto-humans or something like that. But now, think about this, right? What is natural selection preserving? If we have sort of ancient humans 2 million years ago, right? It's going to preserve survival-enhancing behavior. But there are an infinite number of beliefs that are compatible with survival-enhancing behavior, right? So it doesn't actually matter if you're, on the savannah, right, and there are lions, right? What's survival-enhancing is that you run away from them. It actually doesn't matter what you believe about them, right? It might be that you run away from them because you think they're dangerous. It might be that you run away from them because you are trying to play hard to get. And you think, here, kitty, kitty, I'll run from you, right? The point is that there's an infinite possibility in terms of beliefs that would correlate with survival-enhancing behavior. Natural selection doesn't have the ability to say, oh, this is the belief we want. It simply preserves survival-enhancing behavior. Does that mean it's impossible you could have a true belief? No. If that's where we got our faculties from a process like this, the likelihood, the probability that our belief-producing faculties are generally reliable is very, very, very low. In fact, enough to be sort of self-stultifying. Okay, so you see the problem here? Reason itself suddenly gets defeated. And so this is how ultimately kind of corrosive a materialistic view of reality is. All right? Now this gets so extreme, there's another reductive materialist named Alex Rosenberg who has a book out, it's a couple of years ago now, called The Atheist's Guide to Reality. There's a great debate between philosopher William Lane Craig and Rosenberg online that I commend to you all if you're interested in this. But Rosenberg wrote a book in which he said that the idea that we have thoughts about things don't make any sense. Because see, what we intuitively believe, right, is that we have beliefs and ideas, and I can follow an argument, and I think, okay, this follows from this, and then I can come to a conclusion, and then my beliefs can actually shape what I do in the world. But that's implying that there are these things that are beliefs, right? Well, what are beliefs? Well, beliefs are things that are about something else, right? But like a chemical reaction is not about something else in the same way that a belief is, right? And so if you are committed to a reductionist view of the human person, what are beliefs going to be? Well, they basically can be one of two things. And this is the literature on this. Beliefs either supervene on a neurochemical structure in the brain, which means that beliefs are different from the neurochemical structure, right? But the thing that's doing the work is that neurochemical structure, and the belief is determined by that thing. And so it's just epiphenomenal. The belief just spins off of this physically determined thing and gives us an illusion that our beliefs are actually doing something. But the physical structures are the things that are doing things. Now that's the non-reductive view. The reductive view is that beliefs just are a neurophysiological structure and nothing else. All right, and that seems the more consistent but the most counterintuitive of the views. And this is the view that Alex Rosenberg takes. Here's just one choice quote from the book. He said, "The notion that thoughts are about stuff is illusory. Think of each thought input-output neural circuit as a single still photo. Now put together a huge number of input-output circuits in the right way. None of them is about anything. Each is just an input-output circuit firing or not." Okay, Alex Rosenberg will say with a straight face that he wrote a book that's not about anything, all right? But this is where this gets you. So you can see this doesn't just sort of undercut these core libertarian values. It actually undercuts a heck of a lot that we take for granted. Now, I know this is kind of challenging because you're thinking, okay, but wait, I know intuitively I interact with the world that most of my beliefs are true. Of course, I'm not saying if you're a materialist, you should now suddenly doubt the reliability of your faculties. This is the claim that if you trust the reliability of your faculties, you have a very good reason not to be a materialist. That's the point of the argument. All right? Finally, moral truth. What is a moral truth? Right? I mean, we understand what, hydrogen is the lightest element on the periodic table. Right? The inverse square law of gravity. We kind of have a sense of what that is, and you can see how that can kind of be accounted for in a materialistic understanding of reality. But what is this? It's wrong to torture small children for the fun of it. What is that exactly? Now, every one of you, when you heard that, if you thought about it, at least have the sensation that you know that's true, right? You know it directly, and you know it more directly and certainly, at least the way you hold it, than any truth of philosophy, any truth of science, any truth of history. You know it directly, right? And intuitively. It doesn't mean it couldn't possibly be wrong, but we need to see that that's the way in which we experience these things. Well, none of that ultimately makes sense. It doesn't, the moral truths don't fit in a materialistic framework. They're very weird sort of things. And here's how Michael Roos and E.O. Wilson put it. They're a scientist and a philosopher. They write a lot about these things. And in a book in 1991, here's what they said. They said, "Morality, or more strictly our belief in morality, is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. In an important sense, ethics as we understand it is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. It is without external grounding. Ethics is illusory inasmuch as it persuades us that it has an objective reference." Now, what's their point here? The point is this, that look, you can account for things like moral beliefs and religious beliefs because they can confer a survival advantage, right? And so cultures in history that think it's a good idea to eat their children, right? They're going to tend to get weeded out of the gene pool, and the cultures that don't do that are going to tend to be preserved, right? And then in that culture, they might come to believe that it's wrong to eat your children, right? Or especially in non-emergency situations or whatever, right? Okay, but their point is that, look, yeah, okay, it makes sense that you would come to have those beliefs. It makes sense that there would be religious beliefs, that there's a moral law, that we ought to be altruistic, that we ought to be kind to people and not eat our children and all those kind of things. But those are simply the result of a sort of survival-enhancing belief correlated to a behavior, right? Those things get us to cooperate, but they're not objectively true. And Roos and Wilson in this book explicitly say that strictly speaking, moral claims are false. They don't even have a referent. They don't even really make any sense. But they are selected for. Now, notice what they're saying. What they're saying is that natural selection, and these guys are fully materialistic Darwinists, can select for massively, stupendously false beliefs. about the most important questions that we could ask and select for them based upon survival enhancing behavior. You see how this isn't just this is a hugely important thing, because if it can select for false beliefs on things like this, how likely is it that our capacity for sort of higher math or very abstract theories about what happened in the distant past are likely to be reliable? You see the problem here. All right? Well, so then the final question is then, how do we defend limited government? Just think in your own mind about arguments you've heard. If you know, go to the Cato website or AEI or IFWE or Heritage or wherever and look at arguments for limited government. Right? They involve things like reason. They involve things like individual rights. They involve the idea that individual human beings have intrinsic value and dignity that the state must respect. Right? They presuppose the idea of freedom. They presuppose the idea that the state has a certain jurisdiction but ought not to go beyond that. It presupposes all of these things that we've just seen simply don't make sense in a materialistic framework. And so it should be no surprise, right, that materialism can end up being used as a justification for a highly controlling administrative state. Now, the most kind of compelling, I'm reading this book right now, Nudge, and some of you, I'm sure, have read it. It's actually, I'm reading behavioral economics right now, which is a depressing subject, because you discover that we do lots of things that don't make a whole lot of sense, unfortunately. You know, and so maybe you're not quite as rational as we think we are. But look, if we are just ultimately the result of nature and nurture, right? Okay, now there's a kind of incoherence here, but you can see how that would attract people to think, look, you know, there aren't agents, there aren't autonomous cells with rights and freedoms that ought to be respected, right? They're just blind matter in motion. There's just these collections of atoms that do certain things. And so there's no reason why that could not be controlled from a panopticon, right? From a central authority that sees all and determines all. It's very hard to mount an argument for limited government if you have now undercut all these things. And why is that? Well, it's essentially because what you have is suicidal reasoning. You want to defend these libertarian values, right? But you're undercutting it because the metaphysical assumptions you're making don't allow those things to exist. They don't cohere with it. And so you're like the guy that's sawing off the branch that he's sitting on. You're undercutting the foundation of the very thing that you're trying to defend. And so how do you avoid suicidal reasoning on these libertarian values? Well, I think it's simple. The easiest way to do this is to be a theist. If you're a theist, you think ultimate reality is based on freedom, right? We are creatures made in the image of a free and creative God, and are given the endowments and properties to do these kinds of things, right? That a being that's eternally existent, that's fully reasonable and good, that grounds these things very, very easily, and in a way that materialism never can. So that's why I would argue that libertarians ought to be theists. Thank you very much. Yeah, so we're going to do this thing where you write down questions. And the reason we're doing this is because I wrote a book about space and planets one time called The Privileged Planet, and I would get questions about people that were alien abductees, and so I try to avoid that now in situations like this. No, but the problem is that if we do this, I think I can get to more questions more quickly, but I thought I was going to have a... Do I have a...
You can go ahead and pass your questions into the center, and Irene will come collect them.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, that's a good one. Yeah, there's going to be... Okay, I've got a couple of alien abductee questions here, though. Y'all aren't doing your... That is... Let me, gosh, we got a bunch. Let me answer this one. Can you explain the Christian argument for free market economics? Can you explain a mere theist argument? Well, my view is that the case for a free market, that is for economic freedom, is based both upon first principles, certain moral principles about the nature of human beings and the nature of the human person, which suggest some policies rather than others, but they don't by themselves. Christian theology doesn't by itself provide you with a direct answer about whether the takings provision in the Endangered Species Act is a good idea, right? The prudential judgment is required, and so what we always have to do, I think, when we're talking about economic questions, if you're a Christian, is that you want to, as well as you can, integrate what I would call the perennial truths and insights of theology and morality with the theoretical insights and empirical discoveries of economics. And so you might not know if you cite the Nicene Creed that it's a bad idea to have a minimum wage if people are really poor, right? You learn that from economics. And this, in Christian theology, there's this tradition that God reveals himself in two books. So not the Old and New Testaments, probably what you're thinking, but the one book is God's special revelation of himself in Scripture, in which we find out what God does in history. We learn his name, right? Nobody knows the name of the Creator unless he tells it to you, and that's what he does. That's God's special revelation of himself. And then there's God's general revelation of himself, and the general revelation is just the created order. Jesus, when he became incarnate, didn't drop into an alien universe. He dropped into a universe that already, as the Psalm says, testifies to his existence and his glory. Paul in the book of Romans says, from the foundation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature are clearly seen from the things that have been made. So the created order already testifies and points beyond itself to the existence of a creator, but it does it in a very general rather than specific way. And so I think if you're a Christian, what you want is you want the best knowledge from both books. And if you interpret those books correctly and understand them, then they mutually reinforce themselves, but they also give you information that you don't get from one of the other books. You know, Leviticus won't give you the periodic table, for instance. So, got some more. So there was a really good challenge. This one's good. This is a challenge. Haven't you defined libertarianism and libertarian values in a way that's rather favorable to your ultimate claim? Right, now that's a legitimate question. Yeah, if you can, it's great if you sort of frame, you know, it's the drunk looking for his keys under the street light, right? Because that's the only place he can see, so he must have dropped them here. Have you just defined it in a way that's conducive to this? For instance, plenty of, quote, libertarians, Hayek or Mises, reject objective moral truth and adopt a consequentialist utilitarian rights theory. You know, that's exactly right. They do that. But what I'm arguing is that they're finally not coherent. If you read Hayek's Fatal Conceit, for instance, and he's trying to argue how you can have a spontaneous order, how you can have the extended order, even though he was actually in some ways kind of a moral traditionalist and a conservative, in other ways he was finally a materialist. And so he said, how can you just have order emerge from chaos? And what he says is, well, we already know in cosmology that order emerges from chaos. We already know in the origin of life and biology that order emerges from chaos. So there's no problem having it in economics. Well, that's not actually true. Cosmologists don't study order emerging from chaos. They study a universe which is very precisely fine-tuned in its initial conditions and constants. And so my view is that actually Hayek and Mises had very good intuitions about the human person and the value of freedom, but that most of their arguments actually work much better in a theistic framework. And I honestly, that's what I think, this is why I'm so passionate about not simply free markets, but the integration of theology and free markets, because I think that they justify and make sense of things that people that might, like Ayn Rand, right? I use her as an example, usually, right? I mean, Hayek is a Baptist compared to Rand, right? And yet she says every man is an end to the ends of others. But it is a legitimate claim, but I think just consult yourself. What did I say the core libertarian values are? Did those core libertarian values sound idiosyncratic? Or do they sound like the kind of things that most people that are libertarians actually spend a heck of a lot of time talking about? Right? I didn't say anything about pornography or pot or any of that stuff, but I'm assuming those are kind of policies. Those aren't fundamental principles. And so the list was actually longer than this, but I realized that it was going to take too long and be tedious, and so I just stuck to those 5. How can we approach people who hold the belief that it doesn't matter that I actually believe in X? that is, I believe in rights. It matters that I act like I do. Well, there's something to that. I mean, certainly how people behave is the thing that primarily affects other people. I mean, you don't have direct access to what I'm privately believing. You have access to the things that I think I have beliefs, and you have beliefs, and I think because we're both immaterial and material objects that our beliefs can actually shape how things happen in the physical universe and all these kinds of things. And so, you know, I think that sort of makes perfect sense. But the problem is that I think it's a very, very unstable position to hold because, I mean, we want to see if things are coherent or not. We generally have an impression that it would be nice if the things that I believe actually didn't contradict each other, right? If you hold beliefs that are contradictory, for instance, that we exercise freedom and have freedom and rights and all these things, but you're also a materialist, right, then you're essentially holding beliefs that I'm arguing are incompatible. And if you're going to do that and you're satisfied doing that, then okay, fine, but you can't criticize other people you know, from the Progressive Policy Institute when they argue incompatible things, right? Because you're doing that. We generally think that coherent beliefs is an intellectual virtue, and we prize it in ourselves and we prize it in others. And so I think the more rational procedure is to say, if the things that I believe are most true, right, are true, right, and I'm going to hold them, what would need to be true about reality? And work your way back from that and say what would need to be true about reality in order for those things to be true. That's not a deductive proof of the truth of those things. I'm not recognize that. This argument's called an abductive argument, okay, in which you're saying what would need to be true for this to be true. All right? Well, that's the question I just read. Some of these, the problem with this method is I can't read people's writing, but okay, do you agree with the non-aggression principle? And if so, is it biblical? And if it is, how can we justify the existence of the state? My view, yeah, I thought I got to find the anarcho-libertarian argument in here. My own view is that in general, it is wrong to coerce other people, but that in some cases it is just. It's not just permissible, it's just to coerce people. And we all know this, right? If somebody comes into your house and you know, they're going to rape and kill your wife and your children, we don't just say, well, it should be permissible that this man should maybe kill this rapist, right? No, we know all the way down in our bones that he ought to kill or at least stop that guy. He ought to coerce him, right? And so I think there are conditions under which it's not just permissible, but it's actually just to coerce people. I just think that they're very limited conditions. And so insofar as the logic of the state is coercion, we want to be very careful about the tasks that we assign to the state because, you know, sometimes this is justified, and I think there are things that a state with a military can do that would be very difficult to do with sort of straight contracts or things like that. I'm not saying we couldn't do these experiments. I just think morally, if there is a justification in some circumstances to coerce, then there's a justification for coercive power in the hands of the state. Now here's the problem, is that we want the state then to be powerful enough to be able to do that kind of coercion and coercing, but not so powerful that it becomes the violator of the rule of law. That's the dilemma, is how you both endow a state with the power to enforce the rule of law properly without violating the rule of law. And that's very difficult in a fallen human condition. So I'm not an anarcho-libertarian. I'm a Christian free marketer, and I buy all the good free market arguments. So, can one make an argument for God's sovereignty in relation to free agency? What would it look like? Well, there is a difficult kind of debate here about the role in which, you know, how is it that God can both create a world? I mean, there's several possibilities, right? Maybe God creates a world, but he determines everything that's going to happen from the beginning, right? Well, there could be a type of freedom we would have there, but it would be what's called compatibilist freedom. It's a type of freedom that's compatible with a certain type of determinism. Now, there are theological traditions that sometimes get interpreted in that way. The other possibility is that God creates free agents, but because we act free, he can't anticipate what we're going to do, so he creates a world of free agents, and then he waits around to see what we do, and then he's surprised, right? That's the open theist route. The traditional Christian view is a complicated, but I think more subtle and satisfying view, which is that God, as Thomas Aquinas says, grants to creatures the dignity of causality. So God, he is so powerful and so sovereign that he is capable of creating a world which itself has creators in it, lower C creators, that themselves have a capacity for creation and for causality that he doesn't hoard unto himself. He's exercising his sovereignty in doing that. And so he can freely choose to make creatures who do this. Now, how you reconcile that with divine foreknowledge and these kind of biblical descriptions of election, it is complicated, but I think the defensible view is that God grants us limited but real libertarian freedom. We don't have absolute freedom to do anything, but he does gives us a massive range of freedom. He's given us the capacity to blow up the whole world, right? I mean, that's how much God prizes freedom. And so even if all-powerful God accepts a trade-off, right? There's just an implication about creating free beings. This is Augustine's argument in the Confessions, is that everything that God creates is good insofar as it has being and is a creation. So what's evil? Well, evil is a movement away from being, the ground of being, to non-being and to nothingness. And so evil is like the shadow. It's real, but it's not a positive reality. It's like a shadow is. A shadow is, right, doesn't exist unless you have a light source, and then it sort of displaces the light source. That's the nature of evil. Well, then how do we encounter evil as a kind of objective, intangible reality in the world? We encounter it because agents who are choosing to do evil can do things. And so that gives it a sort of objective reality. God doesn't create evil. But he accepts the trade-off that if you're going to create beings that have genuine freedom, they have the ability to move in the direction of non-being. And so it's, I don't, some people who are Calvinists take the compatibilist view, some that don't. I studied at Calvin Seminary, and most of the folks there thought that we didn't exercise libertarian freedom with respect to our choice to accept Christ initially, but we exercise libertarian freedom everywhere else. But there are others that would be more deterministic. So, but that's not my view. So we'll move from there. So let me. Natural law, is it consistent with God's sovereignty? If natural law exists and everyone has access to it by reason, isn't your thesis severely damaged? No, because I'm not saying that, if, say, Christopher Hitchens, who's now deceased, that he necessarily has perfect access to the natural law. Paul says in Romans that the Gentiles, although they had not the law, that is the law that God gave to the Jews on Mount Sinai, nevertheless did what the law required because the law was written on their hearts. That's the natural law, and I think it's just a part of God's created reality in the same way that physical laws are. And so people have it's imperfect understanding of it, but it mainly exists at a very general level. And so people that don't have a kind of full access to the counsel of God can also often go wrong in their moral assessments. But nevertheless, even if you're kind of confused about certain things that might really be murder and you might think they're not murder, you still know murder's wrong. Right? This is normally, for instance, how the debate on abortion goes. It's not that some people say, oh no, I think murder's okay, and others think it's not. The argument is whether it's murder. Right? That's a recognition of the natural law. Everybody recognizes that murder is wrong, but they can disagree as to what are instances of it or not. And so my understanding is that there's a natural law and a created order in which we have access to by reason, but we live in a fallen world, and so that understanding is fragmented and fractured. But for instance, the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, or the negative form of it, don't do to others what you would have them not do to you, that exists in every culture. Right? And every major religion has that principle in some form. And so to me, that's an evidence that there's a natural law. And I think the world would be a much worse place if it were not so. And so if you think, well, that challenged the authority of Scripture. No, I don't think so, because I think it's what Scripture actually says. And that's why I sort of quote Romans on that. I may have gotten all through all these questions. Give me just a sec. How much time do we have? One more? Let me make sure. I feel like this actually has 3 questions on it now, I see. Okay, it's almost unreadable. If we look at nature and man in his natural state, shouldn't we conclude that might makes right? yeah, in the natural state, I assume that means like what people would do if left to their own devices. What people would do if left to their own devices, you can read about in William Golding's book, The Lord of the Flies. That's what kids do, especially English schoolboys left on a deserted island. You know what happens. The big ones lord it over and enslave the little ones, right, and torment and torture them. That's kind of the natural state in some ways. I mean, that's the sort of dark side. But the reality is that even you know, most cultures that actually exist for any kind of duration have to have some kind of access to moral structures, a recognition about the importance of marriage to society and the importance of not stealing all the time from everyone and killing from everyone. And so I think people have an intuitive sense that might by itself does not make right. In fact, I mean, who made this argument initially, right? It was Plato. Plato did not have access to biblical revelation, and yet he recognized that we know kind of intuitively that simply having the power to force people to do what you want them to do is not what we mean when we talk about right or morality. Well, thanks so much for your time and for coming out tonight. Appreciate it.